And I call the member for Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This afternoon I'd like to talk about what I believe is a terrible mistake my government's making. And it involves what is known as the Moorebank Intermodal, which I believe, when history is recorded, will go down as an example, a classic example of governments picking winners but only ending up picking losers. Now, by way of background, we must try and work out the most efficient ways to get freight around the city of Sydney. And if we look historically, Sydney Port was where the freight came in. Today, what was down the terminal, the container terminal down at Sydney Port, is now Barangaroo, an international tourist attraction. That was when our freight, Madam Deputy Speaker, the container handling capacity of Sydney was relocated to Port Botany. Now, the problem that Sydney has had, as the city has grown, the demographic heart of Sydney has moved further west. So the goods that arrive from overseas in shipping containers have to be transported further from Port Botany to further out west. And a lot of the land around the Port Botany area, which was traditionally used as warehousing, because that land cost has increased so substantially in price, it's now prohibitive for most importers of consumer goods to be located nearby the port, and they've had to relocate further out in Western Sydney. Now, in the past, it would be a simple matter of the ship coming in, the container is lifted off the container, it's put onto the deck, it's lifted up off the deck and put on the stack. A truck would come in, the container would be taken from the stack to the back of the truck, and it would go off to the warehouse.
I just ask members on my left just to either speak very quietly or speak outside, please.
Now, using an intermodal is actually a form of double handling, because it puts another lift, another process in the distribution chain where the container goes from the port. Instead of going on the back of a truck, it goes on the back of a train and then gets taken out to Western Sydney and then gets lifted off that train and then put on a truck and then taken to its location of where the container needs to go. So it's to start with, it's a double handling. So for an intermodal concept to actually work, you need to move the container further enough by rail so you pick up the savings in road versus rail to offset those double handling costs. Now, this is where Moorebank was a failed idea from the very start. Firstly, anyone looking at this situation about where an intermodal should be located and if one was actually needed, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would make the point, the question if one is actually needed is still an issue that has not even been determined by the market. Almost a decade ago now, a proposal was made to build an intermodal hub at Enfield. This was only about 25 kilometres away from Port Botany, or 25 minutes via road. Now, what happened, Madam Deputy Speaker? The New South Wales infrastructure, no less an authority, the New South Wales infrastructure stated that Enfield would provide the test case if short-haul intermodal in Sydney would be commercially viable. Now, it is now 3 years overdue from opening the Enfield intermodal. The operator that was originally going to take it has pulled out and is no longer prepared to run it because they don't think they can make it commercially viable, Madam Deputy Speaker. This should ring warning bells on the failure of what we do. And it was interesting, we had a meeting here in Parliament House with some of the people that from the government bureaucracy, from the Department of Infrastructure, that are promoting the Moorebank Intermodal, and I said to them, Enfield is not being accepted by the market. Why would then Moorebank be successful if Enfield's not successful, given that Enfield has been described as the test case? And they said, oh, well, Enfield didn't work because it's too close to Port Botany. This shows how they've got it completely wrong. Because although the distance from Port Botany to Enfield is closer than the distance from Port Botany to Moorebank, that's as the crow flies. In logistics, it's not the distance as the crow flies, it's the time that you take to travel. And if you go via any form of, whether by truck or by car, the time that it takes you to get from Port Botany to Enfield as compared to the time it takes you to get from Port Botany to Moorebank is virtually the same. Anyone can do that test on Google Maps and you can see it's virtually the same. There is simply no savings.
Excuse me, if you could just resume your seat for a moment. A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions.
So if we are going to have an intermodal in Sydney, even though the test case of Enfield has failed, where should it be? Now, the first thing you would do is you would have a look at where the containers are actually going to from Port Botany at the moment. Now, if you do that analysis, it's very clear. The biggest area where containers are being delivered from Port Botany into Western Sydney is at Eastern Creek. And that's one of the areas that one of the earlier studies identified as the most suitable location. But somewhere on the line, Moorebank came up as a supposedly cheaper option. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll just run through what that cheaper option is actually going to cost. Firstly, we've had to relocate the School of Military Engineering. Now, it's wonderful that we have a new School of Military Engineering, Madam Deputy Speaker, but we had an existing school which will be completely bulldozed and demolished. So what value we have actually added by building that new School of Military Engineering, we already had an existing one, is very debatable. And for that, Madam Deputy Speaker, we spent close to $970 million. So that was the first cost. The second cost we have, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to clear and to rehabilitate the land on the School of Military Engineering. That is another $100 million cost to government. Thirdly, if Moorebank was ever going to be successful, what it would require is a major upgrade of all the road network surrounding it, especially and including an on-ramp onto the M5 and another crossing over the Georges River. This is estimated, Madam Deputy Speaker, at costs of upwards another $750 million. So by the time it's all finished, Madam Deputy Speaker, this so-called cheaper option will have cost the taxpayer $2 billion in costs. And yet we are getting a second-rate proposal. Now, we have three completely false concepts that this intermodal is built around. Secondly, it will take trucks off the road. All it actually does, Madam Deputy Speaker, is relocate where the trucks depart from. So instead of the trucks departing from Port Botany, they'll now depart from Moorebank. And Moorebank is an area of more congestion than actually is already around Port Botany. Secondly, Moorebank being so far to the southwest of Sydney and not being centrally located will actually result in more trucks and more traffic on roads. In fact, a study was done by a company called Transport Modelling, where they looked at a typical importer of consumer goods that would distribute those goods to retail shopping centres around New South Wales. And they found if an importer moved from either Eastern Creek or Wetherill Park or the Shallora area and moved down to Moorebank, they would actually have their trucks on the road up to 10% more. So actually by relocating to Moorebank, we are putting trucks more times on the road, Madam Deputy Speaker. The other issue, of course, is the air pollution. The argument was that this would reduce air pollution. Now, there is some truth in that, or partly truth. If you put you are moving goods by rail as compared to road, if you move them via rail, you use half the less diesel fuel. But the problem, Madam Deputy Speaker, as compared to a truck, so the train uses half the fuel to the truck. But the problem is, Madam Deputy Speaker, the train spews out particulate matter 18 times more for litre of diesel fuel burnt than a truck does. So what we actually have, we get that's almost a 9 times increase in particulate matter spewed out in Western Sydney. Madam Deputy Speaker, and this is the time we must remember, the World Health Organisation has classified particulate matter as a carcinogen. We already have levels of particulate matter in Western Sydney right on the threshold, the recommended levels of the World Health Organisation. So we should be doing everything we can to reduce those levels of particulate matter in Western Sydney. And yet here we are with a proposal that will have a 9-fold increase in every single container moved via rail rather than road. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a project that needs a serious second look at.
I thank the member for Hughes.